world of ours is filled with incredible life, as you can see on a spring day like this. Scientists, in fact, estimate that they're discovering upwards of 15,000 new species of life every year. And they believe there might be up to 8 million species of life living on our planet. Where in the world did all of this life come from? Well, there's essentially two views. One view is that it's the result of a natural evolutionary process, and the other view is that a creator created it all. Those who hold to a natural evolutionary process believe that in some primordial time in the distant past that the right elements came together of nitrogen and hydrogen and ammonia and carbon dioxide, and that this was hit by some energy source like the sun or perhaps lightning and created the first simple amino acids. These then evolved into the first simple proteins, which developed into the first simple cells, and on and on. Is this a possibility? Well, Dr. Stephen Meyer, a geophysicist who earned his doctorate at Cambridge, wrote, "Consider what you'd need for a protein molecule to form by chance. First, you need the right bonds between the amino acids. Second, amino acids come in right-handed and left-handed versions, and you've got to get only left-handed ones. Third, the amino acids must link up in a specified sequence like letters in a sentence. Run the odds of these falling into place on their own, and you find that the probabilities of forming a rather short functional protein at random would be 1 chance in 100,000 trillion, 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 trillion. That's a 10 with 125 zeros after it. And that would only be one protein molecule. A minimally complex cell would need between 300 and 500 protein molecules. Now, even the simplest cell contains a marvelous device called DNA, a storage device that holds tens of thousands of bits of information that helps the cell be what it is and helps duplicate the cell to another cell like itself. The DNA is such a marvelous storage device that scientists are trying to use it to store computer information. And to this date, they've been able to store 700 terabytes of information in a single gram of DNA. In a single gram of DNA, they can store 700 terabytes of information. Now, it would take 14,000 Blu-ray discs to hold this much information. Yes, DNA is organized information. And to have organized information, you must have an informant that organizes it all. You know, if you were to spot a bunch of stones out here in the woods, you'd figure that they were just placed randomly there by a glacier in the distant past. But if those stones were grouped together in such a way that they distinctly spelled out the letters and the words, "I love Lucy," then you'd know that somebody put those stones in that order. And so DNA virtually shouts out at us that it was designed by a designer. Now, the Christian view is that is exactly what happened, that we have a creator God who put it all here. Now, those who hold to a creator, especially Christians, do take different approaches to it. Some hold to a literal 6-day creation, a young earth view, it's called. They believe Genesis, that the word day there literally means a day, and so they believe it was created in 6 days. There are old earth Christians who hold an old earth view that believe the day does refer to eons of time, and we do use the word day that way, you know, in back in those days, we'll say something like that, so the word can be used that way. And then there are those who are theistic evolutionists that believe God used an evolutionary process. Well, it doesn't really matter ultimately how God did it. We believers stand unified in believing that God did, in fact, create it all, and that Genesis does summarize it very well. And here I just quote the highlights of several verses from Genesis 1. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures. And God said, let the land produce living creatures. And then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." You know, we can't use science to disprove God, for science can only deal with that which is measurable and tangible. And God is spirit. Those of us who believe in him believe that he is spirit, and therefore that you can't disprove God by science. And in fact, if you want to hold an open-minded view, you should explore the hypotheses that everything here was created by somebody outside of creation. That in fact it takes a much smaller step of faith, it seems to many of us, than the leap of faith it takes to believe that it just somehow, against humongous odds, evolved on its own. Dr. Francis Collins, a geneticist who is the head of the Human Genome Project, says that 40% of scientists do believe in God, that God created it all. He further states, I began to realize that the evidence for the existence of God, while not proof, was actually pretty compelling. It made me realize that atheism would no longer be an acceptable choice for me, as it was the least rational of the options. And so as you look around at all that is, the tremendous diversity and the lushness of life, there are those two options that somehow against huge odds, and maybe the odds are totally against it 100%, this life exists, or to believe that a creator outside space and time, beyond energy and matter, created it all. That many of us believe. It takes a lot less leap of faith than to believe it just all happens to be here. That in fact there probably isn't enough evidence to compel belief, but there is enough evidence to make belief in God compelling.